19th of November, 1967, Vietnam Highlands. After weeks of fighting, exhausted American soldiers prepare to advance up a hill in the middle of the jungle. Bombs and shells fall on the enemy-controlled summit. The men advance, stumbling on the bodies of their comrades. Many of them will join the dead. Nothing is simple in the jungle. Snipers become ghosts. Bunkers are hidden until they erupt in deadly fire. This is the Battle of Dak To, the most brutal 33 days of the Vietnam War. When the US landed troops in Vietnam, they could not expect the kind of war they were getting themselves into. After 2 years of fighting, between 1965 and 1967, hope for a swift victory was slowly beginning to vanish, leaving room for unrest both among the troops and the public at home. While America was hoping for a spectacular display of military power, Vietnamese forces chose to turn the war into an eternal jungle siege between two tired opponents, desperately trying to choke the life out of one another. Not only was the war bloody and costly, but it was turning into the only thing a conflict should never be. In order to maintain positive public attention, it was becoming boring. For those on the ground, of course, boredom would be a dream come true, as they were constantly targeted by Viet Cong guerrillas in the regions they occupied and raided by the People's Army of Vietnam, or PAVN, on the front line. Bloody jungle hills. Spring 1967 was a troublesome time in the middle section of the Vietnamese front, a highland region covered in an almost impenetrable jungle. The area, defended by the 4th Infantry Division under the command of Major General William R. Pierce, was seeing more and more deadly contacts with the enemy, leading him to ask for reinforcements. His request was answered on the 17th of June, when 2 battalions of the 173rd Airborne Brigade were moved from the Saigon region to the region of Dak To. The paratroopers felt confident they could hold their own. They had, after all, successfully fought Viet Congs for a long time and thought of themselves as veterans in every sense of the word. What awaited them on the front line, though, was an actual army, far deadlier in a straight-up fight, ready to stand up to their assault and face them head-to-head in deadly combat. Pierce, now reinforced and ready, began lashing out at the North Vietnamese. What followed were months of blood, at the end of which the Dak To Valley had become a primary target for the PAVN forces. But at the end of summer, they seemed to disappear into nothing, leaving the eerie silence that usually fills the air right before the storm. It wouldn't take long for US intelligence to see this as the feint it truly was. The bloody summer was just a prelude. The real punch was yet to be thrown. In October, Major General Pierce and his men were already noticing a slow buildup of enemy troops. The North Vietnamese army was moving forces from other regions to prepare for a large offensive against the Dak To area, building up their 1st Infantry Division for a real face-off against the Pierce 4th Division and his paratroopers' reinforcements. The valley of Dak To and the surrounding occupied area represented both a strong position and a weak point in the American front. The importance of such a forward base cannot be understated, as it was the best possible location to scout the enemy activity and find out their secrets. Disruption of the river of supplies coming through the Ho Chi Minh Trail was, after all, one of the best ways to ensure Vietnam would end up in an American victory. On the other hand, being wedged deep in the North Vietnamese territory, such a base of operation was susceptible to being surrounded, attacked on multiple sides. An expected slaughter. On November the 2nd, a deserting Vietnamese officer provided the Americans with their enemy plan. Attacks were to be launched from the south and southwest, helped by a secondary attack from the northeast. The whole operation would receive support by both rocket and conventional artillery, with the objective of cutting off and destroying as many American forces as possible. Such an offensive could not be allowed to go unhindered. Battalion after battalion of the 4th Infantry Infantry Division was sent to Dak To, preparing to disrupt the enemy operation. This counterattack would take the name of Operation MacArthur and bring the total Allied troops in the area up to 16,000, a sizable force of both Americans and South Vietnamese elements. Vietnam operations suffered from a deep fog of war. In more conventional conflicts, planes and scouts could be used to keep an eye on the enemy from a relatively safe distance, allowing commanders to make decisions over a fairly clear front line. When American troops began patrolling operations around Dak To, though, a bone-chilling discovery was made. The entire region had been prepared under their nose months in advance. Bunkers and trenches were dug, traps were laid, all under the protection of the jungle. The Pavan forces were not only preparing to attack, but were already organized to fight the US troops from an advantageous position. Traces of an invisible fortress had appeared on their map, and they could not determine how dire the situation already was. The coming battle wasn't just an attempt to cut down American forces by the North Vietnamese. The attack was part of a larger strategy and supposed to cause enough damage to convince the American High Command of the necessity to send more and more troops on the northern border. Such a change in American deployment would leave the Viet Cong free to regain all the ground they lost in the south, nullifying years of US work to gain local support and secure their supply lines. To force a larger engagement in the highlands was, finally, highly advantageous to the North Vietnamese war effort, as the terrain minimized American superior firepower, allowing for longer and deadlier engagements. November the 3rd marked the beginning of what was to be known as the Battle of Dak To. Both elements of the 4th Infantry Division and the 173rd Airborne engaged enemy fortified positions in the hills and began combing them. The jungle forced both sides into close-quarters combat, a situation that heavily favored the North Vietnamese, happy to be safe from American artillery and air support. The Battle of Dak To. The Dak To Valley was covered with a jungle so deep most bombardments wouldn't even remove the canopy. The local wildlife was highly dangerous, and visibility was low, sometimes practically non-existent. Soldiers were engaged in combat in a lush green nightmare. War in the jungle meant fighting the unknown. It was easy for a large force to disperse and lose contact within itself, becoming easy prey for the ambush-based guerrilla of the North Vietnamese army. To counteract this fact, Major General Pierce worked tirelessly to keep a strict cohesion between his forces, forcing them close to each other, avoiding being isolated at all costs. On November the 4th, the methodical way the Americans had fought was sidelined in favor of a reckless thrust. After a devastating bombardment, combing artillery and air superiority, the 4th Battalion of the 503rd Airborne attacked Hill 823, dropped on top of it by helicopter. The top of the hill was shaved by explosives and found empty by the air-dropped men, but Vietnamese elements made themselves known soon after, having survived the airstrike. A brutal fight ensued, leaving 9 Americans dead, 28 wounded, and at least 100 enemy casualties. But the risky move proved worthwhile when the paratroopers repelled the counterattack. Hill 823 would become a key fire support position and provided fire support for the entire battle. During the night of November the 12th, North Vietnamese artillery strikes began pounding the nearby American airstrip. Even if the air forces were reasonably safe during operations, these attacks made them fear for their life while refueling. Munition storages and even a C-4 container were hit, resulting in large explosions and extensive damage. More than one C-130 Hercules transports were also destroyed. The American reaction was swift and devastating. Between the 12th and the 15th of November, US artillery and air force bombed the now revealed North Vietnamese firing positions aimed at their base in Dak To. Infantry assaults deep into enemy territory followed, reaching and capturing part of the bunker network on Hill 882. The North Vietnamese had tried their hand at finishing the job, but that was going to be as far as they would go offensively. While the battle was raging, a logistical nightmare was unfolding. 863,190 gallons of JP-4 fuel and 32,550 gallons of aviation gasoline were used by helicopters and planes engaged in 2,096 air sorties in Dak To. An unimaginable amount of ammunition was being used at all times. The 77 tubes of artillery alone fired over 151,000 rounds. These supplies were brought to forward bases in order to reduce the time spent on resupply. Many among those behind the line risked their life and worked night and day tirelessly in order to keep the American war machine going. Deadly Hill 875. Day after day, the offensive capacity of the North Vietnamese forces was being nullified. But as long as they were present in the area, the battle could not stop. Hill 875 still stood, heavily defended and pouring fire on the American forces around. 3 companies, A, C, and D, of the 2nd Brigade 175th Airborne were sent in on November 19th. The resulting fight would be the violent climax of the Battle of Dak To. The men climbing the hill found only silence waiting for them. More than 300 soldiers advanced. Following the standard American offensive formation, 2 groups would move ahead, leaving one behind to provide support. Dogs were used to scout, trained to smell and detect enemy activity. Sergeant Stephen Welch, leading a vanguard squad, saw trouble coming. Quote, "You knew they were there, you just couldn't see anything." The advancing companies asked for permission to open fire, performing what's called a recon by fire. This was a simple tactic: shoot where you think the enemy is and watch for return fire to find your target. Their commander, Captain Harold Kaufman, denied the request and ordered a full advance. They marched on, and just as they entered a small clearing, their world became a storm of steel. Hidden in camouflaged bunkers, the North Vietnamese unloaded on Companies C and D. Men were mowed down in an instant, and those who weren't immediately killed were left to find cover behind trees and bushes against heavy, continuous small arms fire. There was no way to identify where the enemy was, no way to advance or retreat. The entire advance was pinned down. 2 hours after the first shot was fired, with the 2 forward companies completely stuck, hidden North Vietnamese forces appeared at the bottom of the hill, assaulting Company A. Hill 875 was turned into a slaughterhouse, a deadly trap. The bunkers defending the hill were, in fact, connected to underground trenches to allow for an easy envelopment, something the North Vietnamese had clearly organized methodically. Company A, being pushed uphill, needed to defend the exposed back of Companies C and D. Some, such as Private First Class Carlos Lozanda, gave their life in solitary rearguard actions, giving their comrades time to reorganize. A perimeter was formed, and the brutal confrontation continued. Chaos and confusion reigned. And when darkness started creeping in, things only got worse. At 7 p.m., when American reinforcements were still trying to relieve the 3 trapped companies, an F-4C Phantom dropped a 750-pound bomb in the middle of those he was trying to save. The horrible friendly fire incident, one of the worst in the history of the Vietnam War, killed 42 Americans and wounded 45 more. Captain Kaufman, the same man who ordered the first advance into the trap, died in the explosion. When the new day came, the airborne troops were hard at work. Having managed to survive the night, they cut trees and plants, managing to create a landing zone that helicopters could use. When the first wounded were transported back to base, the three companies erupted in cheers. Retreat was suggested in order to shave Hill 875 with heavy bombardments, but Brigadier General Schweiter, in command of the 173rd Airborne, declined. To be safe from the airstrike, his men would have to be more than 3,000 meters away from the target, meaning the North Vietnamese forces would be free to retreat and disappear into the jungle. Schweiter had no intention to give an inch. No room for retreat would be given. On the first light of November 23rd, exactly on Thanksgiving, the exhausted and bloodied companies of paratroopers began their last push, conquering the top of Hill 875 in a few hours. In the middle of all that death, and on top of that hellish hill, helicopters finally brought hot Thanksgiving dinners to the victorious soldiers. A small piece of home for those still alive to see it again. Victory or defeat? In the following days, the remaining North Vietnamese forces in the area disengaged and retreated, disappearing into the fog of war. The field was left to the US troops, but the heavy cost of the battle was clear to all those present. North Vietnamese losses would have been a matter of animated discussion, but were undoubtedly heavy, with at least between 1,000 and 1,500 bodies left on the ground. American losses, while fewer, were extremely heavy compared to what was expected. More than 350 were killed in action, and at least 1,200 were wounded. To this must be added a heavy loss of materials, as many helicopters and even planes were destroyed in battle. The second the last bullet was shot, the Battle of Dak To was turned into a contentious topic. To some, the difference in casualties, added to the fact that the US kept control of the area, makes this battle not only a victory, but a proof of the incredible fire superiority that the US forces could muster. On the other hand, even among the American generals, some considered the losses too high to cover the whole affair under a flag of victory, such as General John Chasen. Quote, "Is it a victory when you lose 362 friendlies in 3 weeks, and by your own spurious body count, you only get 1,200? There were those who even asked if the battle was to be fought at all. Some argued that the hills many died to take held no strategic value at all and could be simply ignored, that the entire operation was led by a stubborn will to fight the enemy anywhere at any cost. In the end, the fact that these questions can even be asked is the reason why, among the many wars the US fought, Vietnam was so unique. Strategic objectives were ephemeral, enemies were ghosts, victories were a matter of opinion. In the end, encounters such as the Battle of Dak To and the Tet Offensive that was launched against South Vietnam a year later proved that there was no quick way to victory and contributed to the US decision to finally pull out of the war.